Have you ever been in a room where someone talked about you as if you weren't in it, and realized, in that same second, that this was not the first time? I sat in my daughter's kitchen on a Thursday in October, with a hospital wristband still on my arm and a paper cup of water going warm in my hand, and I heard a man I had lent $41,000 call me a logistics problem. Not a father, not family, a problem to be scheduled. He said it warmly, the way you'd describe a delivery that had come on the wrong day. My daughter didn't say anything. That silence cost me more than the money, and I want to be clear about something before we go further. I had already known, for 9 months, that a certain number in a certain account didn't add up. I just hadn't known it had a name. But to understand what happened the next morning, you need to understand what kind of man I was before that kitchen, because that is exactly the man he was counting on. My name is Walter Rhodes. I'm 68 years old, and I live in Millbrook, 40 minutes outside Rochester, in a house I re-roofed myself in 2004 and have not needed to touch since. I spent 34 years as a diesel mechanic, the last 19 of them running my own shop on Route 31. 3 bays, 2 lifts, and a coffee pot older than my son-in-law. My left knee sounds like a gravel driveway when I stand up. I drive a 1998 Ford F250 that my daughter has been trying to retire since 2016. I drink my coffee black at 5 in the morning because that's when the shop used to open, and my body never got the memo that it closed. But before I go on, do me one small favor. Subscribe. A lot of people listen but never hit the button. It costs you nothing and means everything to us. Hit the like button while you listen and drop a comment with your thoughts. You're going to want to stay for this one. Here is what a good life looked like the last time I had one. 5 in the morning, the kitchen dark except for the light over the stove. The percolator I've had since 1989, the one that ticks 3 times before it starts, like it's clearing its throat. I drink from a green enamel camp mug with a chip on the lip, and I drink it standing at the window, looking at the driveway. Because 34 years of opening a shop teaches you to look at a driveway before you look at anything else. My wife Ellen used to come down at 5:45 in a robe the color of oatmeal and put her cold hands on the back of my neck without saying good morning. She died in 2019, pancreatic. 11 weeks from the diagnosis to the funeral, and I have never once said the word quickly about it, because there was nothing quick about 11 weeks. After that, it was just me and the house and the truck and my daughter Nora. Nora is 34. She's got Ellen's straight back and my bad habit of apologizing before she's finished a sentence.
She's a dental hygienist in Pittsford, good at it, the kind of good where patients ask for her by name. When she was 11, I taught her to change oil in the driveway, and she got a stripe of it across her forehead and refused to wash it off until dinner. That's my kid. That's the whole kid, right there. She married Dorian Vance in the spring of 2021. I want to be fair to him, because being unfair to him would make this a smaller story than it is. Dorian was 38, tall, well-kept, one of those men who look like they've never once been surprised by a mirror. He sold things. Commercial real estate, then something called asset repositioning, then something called consulting. And the through line was that he was always 3 weeks from a closing that would change everything. He shook my hand the first time with both of his, which I have never trusted in my life. And he called me Walt within 4 minutes of meeting me, which nobody has called me since my mother died. He was good to her. I need you to hear that, because if he'd been obviously bad to her, I'd have seen the rest. He remembered her co-workers' names. He learned to make the lemon thing she likes. At the wedding, he gave a toast about how he'd never had a real family, and now he did. And he looked at me when he said it, and his eyes were wet. And I stood up and hugged him in front of 110 people. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because I'm going to come back to it. The first 2 years were fine. Sunday dinners at their place in Pittsford, a house that was too much house, Vaulted ceiling, a kitchen island the size of a pool table, a wine fridge with a glass door and 11 bottles in it that never changed position, which should have told me something. I'd bring a pie from the place on Monroe. Dorian would ask about the shop and listen to about 40% of the answer, and then tell me about a property in Henrietta. Nora would kick me under the table when I got too specific about carburetors. It was pleasant. It was the pleasant of a waiting room, but I didn't know that yet, because Ellen was dead and I was 65, and pleasant was more than I'd expected to get. Then in March of 2023, he asked me for money. He did it well. That's the thing nobody tells you about being taken. It's rarely done badly. He came to the house alone on a Saturday with a folder. He sat at my kitchen table and he didn't touch the folder for 20 minutes. He asked about Ellen. He asked what she'd been like when she was Nora's age. He listened, really listened the first time. And I'll be honest with you, that mattered to me more than I want to admit in front of strangers. Nobody had asked about Ellen in a while. People stop asking.
They think they're being kind. Then he opened the folder. A retail strip in Greece, New York. 4 units, 2 occupied. An anchor tenant supposedly signing in 60 days. He needed $41,000 to close his portion. 6 months, he said. 8%. He said he'd have gone to a bank, but the timeline was the timeline, and he said, and this is the sentence. This is the one, write it down because it comes back. I'd rather owe family than owe a stranger. At least family looks you in the eye. I gave him the money on a Tuesday. Cashier's check, because I don't like wires. He hugged me in the parking lot of the credit union on Ridge Road, and he said thank you 4 times, and the 4th one was quieter than the others, and that's the one I believed. Here's what I want you to understand about a man like me. I'm not a soft touch. I've thrown people out of my shop for less than lying about a warranty. But there is a specific place a widower keeps his judgment, and it is not in the same drawer as his loneliness. And Dorian found the 2nd drawer first. 6 months came, then 8, then a year. He didn't dodge. That's what was clever. A man who dodges makes you suspicious. A man who explains makes you patient. Every 8 or 10 weeks, unprompted, he'd give me an update. The anchor tenant went sideways. The county held up an easement. There was a capital partner named Keith who was slow but solid. Once he paid me $4,000 out of nowhere, in November of 2023, and I remember thinking, see, Walter, see? You're an old man who invents problems. $4,000 is a cheap price for 18 more months of a man's trust. I know that now. Let me tell you about the small thing, because the small things are always the ones that turn out to be load-bearing. At Thanksgiving 2023, Nora asked Dorian about the Greece property in front of me, and he said, the Greece thing's still moving. 2 hours later, in the driveway, walking me to the truck, he said, the Ridgeway property's still moving. Same tone, same shrug, different road. I stood in the dark with my hand on the door handle, and I let it go, because it was cold, and I was full of turkey, and because a man of 66 does not want to be the father-in-law who cross-examines. But something in me, the part that spent 34 years listening to engines, and knowing that the sound before the failure is always small, always something you could talk yourself out of, that part filed it. Greece, Ridgeway. 2 names for 1 hole in the ground. I didn't think he was stealing, I thought he was sloppy. Those are different diagnoses, and I made the wrong one, and I made it for 2 more years. In February of 2025, I got sick. It started as a cough I ignored, the way men my age ignore things, which is to say, aggressively, and with a lot of commentary about how it was nothing. By April, I was down 11 pounds. In May, a doctor at Strong, named Priyanka Raghavan, sat on a rolling stool and told me I had a mass in my right lung the size of a walnut, and that the word she wanted me to hold on to was treatable. And I heard the word mass and nothing else for about 90 seconds. Stage 2. Surgery in July. A lobectomy. 4 nights in the hospital.
Chemo after 4 cycles. Nora cried in the parking garage where she thought I couldn't see her. And then she came up to the room with a coffee for me she knew I wasn't allowed to have. And she put it on the tray anyway and said, "For when you are." That's my kid. Dorian came twice. Once for 11 minutes on day 1, once on discharge day, when he was needed to help me into the car. Both times he said the exact same thing. "You're a tough old bird, Walt."
I'd like to tell you I noticed. I didn't. I was busy being frightened. The chemo put me in a bad way through August and September. There's a specific tiredness that isn't sleepiness. It's like somebody's turned the gravity up. I couldn't drive. I couldn't do the stairs twice in a day. Nora came out to Millbrook 4-5 times a week, 40 minutes each way. And I could see it eating her. The shifts, the drive, the guilt in both directions. And in the first week of October, she and Dorian had the conversation that any family has. Should Dad come stay with us for a while? They invited me for dinner on Thursday the 9th to talk about it. I put on a collared shirt. I want you to know that. 68 years old, 12 pounds down, no hair on the sides anymore. And I stood in front of the mirror and put on a collared shirt to go ask my daughter if I could sleep in her house. I got there 20 minutes early, because I have never in my life arrived on time to anything.
Nora's car wasn't back yet. She'd texted, "Running late, keys under the frog." So I let myself in, and I sat in the kitchen with a paper cup of water. And I heard Dorian on the phone in the next room. In the study, with the door half open, doing that pacing thing he does. He didn't know I was there. "No, it's handled," he said. "No, listen, it's 4 to 6 months, tops. He does the treatment, we do the optics. And honestly, it's better if he's here, because then it's documented." A pause. "Keith, come on, he's 68 with a lung. This isn't a 5-year problem." Another pause. Then, easy as weather. "He'll handle it alone. He always does. That's the beauty of him. You point him at a hard thing and he just absorbs it. He's not a person you manage, he's a logistics problem you schedule." I heard my daughter's car in the driveway. I heard him laugh at something Keith said.
And I sat there in a collared shirt with a hospital band still on my wrist, holding a paper cup, doing the only thing 34 years in a shop trains you to do when you hear a noise you don't like. I stayed very, very still, and I listened for it to happen again. It happened again. He said, "The old man's paper is the least of it." The old man's paper. Nora came in with grocery bags and said, "Dad, you're early," and kissed my cheek. And Dorian came out of the study with his phone in his hand and his face already assembled, and he said, "Walt, there he is," and put both hands around mine. And I smiled and said the shrimp smelled good. That night we talked about the guest room. Dorian was gracious about it. He said the word family 3 times. Nora looked so relieved I could have cracked in half.
And I drove home 40 minutes in the dark with the window cracked because the chemo made everything smell wrong. And I did not think about revenge, not once. I want to be honest about that. I thought about one word: paper. You don't say, "the old man's paper," about a personal loan between family. Paper is a word for an instrument. Paper is a word for something that exists in a file, that somebody could look at, that has terms. There was no paper. He'd never signed anything. I'd handed a man a cashier's check across a credit union parking lot, on the strength of a sentence about looking family in the eye. So what, exactly, was the paper? I would not have an answer to that for 11 days. And when I got it, it did not just change what I thought about my son-in-law. It changed the date. It moved the whole thing backward, past the loan, past the wedding, into a room I'd been standing in without knowing I was in it.
If you've been listening and want more stories like this, it takes one tap. Subscribe. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what you think happened next. Thank you. Genuinely. I want to walk you through what I did next, because I know how it sounds when a man says he started looking into it. It sounds like a montage. It was not a montage. It was a 68-year-old man with a chemo port under his collarbone, sitting at a kitchen table for 4 hours at a stretch, making a list. That's the profession talking. When a truck comes into a shop and the owner says, "It's making a noise," you do not open the hood and start pulling things. You get a pad and you write down every symptom, including the ones the owner says don't matter, especially those. And then you look for the one cause that explains all of them. An engine doesn't have 4 problems. It has 1 problem and 4 complaints.
So, on Friday the 10th of October, at 5:10 in the morning, black coffee in the green enamel mug, I got out a yellow legal pad from the shop. I still have a box of them. They've got Rhodes Diesel and Fleet printed at the bottom in letters that have gone soft from the years. And I wrote down every complaint I had. Grease/Ridgeway. 2 names, 1 property. $4,000 in November 2023. Why then? Keith. No last name, 3 years. The old man's paper. 11 bottles in the wine fridge that never move. He asked about Ellen for 20 minutes before he opened the folder. That last one I wrote down and then sat and looked at for a long time. Because here's the thing about a shop diagnosis. The complaint that bothers you most is usually the real one. And what bothered me most, at 5 in the morning in October, was not the money. It was that a man had asked me 20 careful minutes of questions about my dead wife, and then opened a folder, and that the sequence had felt so natural at the time, and felt so engineered now. I had remembered that conversation as the moment my son-in-law finally saw me. I understood it differently now. It wasn't an introduction. It was an inspection. I started with the property, because property is public, and I'm not a hacker. I'm a man who knows how to go to a counter. Monroe County has an online parcel system. I'm slow with a computer, but I'm not stupid with one. I ran a parts inventory on a machine for 19 years. It took me a day and a half to figure out I was searching wrong, and then about 6 minutes to find what I was looking for. There is a retail strip on Ridgeway Avenue. It exists. 4 units. It was sold in March of 2023, the month he asked me, to a limited liability company called Chandler Row Holdings, LLC. Dorian's name was not on it. I sat back so hard the chair barked on the linoleum, and I want to be accurate about my body here, because I've learned since that the body keeps better notes than the mind. My hands were fine. My hands were completely steady. What went was my mouth. It went dry in about 4 seconds, like I'd been chewing a paper towel. And I got up and drank water straight from the tap like a kid. And then I stood at the sink with my hands on the edge of it and thought, all right, that doesn't prove anything. He said his portion. Partners hold title. That's normal. That's the 4th stage of the diagnosis, by the way, and it's the one that gets people killed. Finding the crack. Then explaining the crack. So I went and looked up Chandler Row Holdings in the New York State Entity Database. Registered agent? A service address in Albany, one of those mail drop outfits. Organizer? A name I didn't know. Filed, February 2023. Members are not public in New York. Dead end. Fine. But the entity search does something else. It lets you search by that agent's address and by name fragments. And on a hunch that came from nothing but the way the word Chandler sat wrong in my ear, I typed Chandler into the box by itself. Chandler Row Holdings, LLC. Filed February 2023. Chandler Point Partners, LLC. Filed August 2021. Chandler and Vance Advisory, LLC. Filed June 2019. Vance. I read that 3rd line maybe 9 times. Then I got up and walked to the front window and looked at my truck in the driveway for a while. Because that's what I do. And the thing I was actually doing was arithmetic. June 2019. Ellen died in April of 2019. Dorian met Nora in September of 2019, at a fundraiser at the Memorial Art Gallery that a friend of hers dragged her to because she'd spent 5 months not going anywhere. He formed a company with the word Chandler in it 3 months before he met my daughter. Now, I know.
I know what you're thinking, because I thought it too, standing at that window. So what? Men form LLCs. A consultant forms an LLC the way a mechanic buys a torque wrench. It means nothing. There's no crime in a date. And that's true. That is completely true. It stayed true for 6 more days. On Wednesday the 15th, I drove to the county clerk's office in downtown Rochester, which I had not been inside since 1994, and I paid $4.80 to have a very patient young man named Marcus pull the recorded documents on the Ridgeway parcel. Deed, mortgage, and a third document I hadn't expected, because I didn't know enough to expect it. An assignment. The mortgage on that property, $310,000, was not from a bank. It was held privately, and it had been assigned in June of 2023, 3 months after the sale, to another entity. Chandler Point Partners, LLC. So the buyer owed the money to a company that shared a name with the buyer.
Money moving from one of his pockets to another, with a recorded document making it look like a transaction. I didn't understand the purpose of it yet, but I understood the shape of it because I've seen this shape before, in a completely different life. When a fleet customer of mine in 2008 started routing invoices through a second company he owned, so he could pay himself first and his creditors never. There's a smell to it. It doesn't smell like theft. It smells like paperwork. Marcus asked if I wanted copies. I said yes to everything. $11 and change. I sat in the truck in the parking garage for a while with an envelope of copies on the passenger seat and the port under my collarbone aching the way it did when I got cold, and I called the one person I could call. Ray Kubiak has been my friend since 1981. He ran the transmission shop 2 doors down from mine for 22 years, and now he's 71 and rebuilds tractor engines in a pole barn in Clarkson because his wife told him he could either have a hobby or a heart attack. Ray talks like a man being charged by the word. He is the single most patient human being I have ever met, and he has never once in 44 years told me what I wanted to hear. I said, "Ray, if I told you something, would you tell me if I was being an old fool about it?" He said, "That's most of what I do." I told him. All of it, in order, in a parking garage, for 25 minutes. The 2 names for one property. The $4,000. Chandler and Vance, June 2019. The phone call. The old man's paper. There was a long pause, long enough that I checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Then Ray said, "Walt. 2 names for one building, that's sloppy. A guy who forms companies, that's Tuesday.
The $4,000's a retainer on your patience, and I don't like it, but it ain't a crime." Another pause. "It's the phone call. He said paper. You don't say paper about a handshake." That's what I keep landing on. "So the question ain't whether he stole your 41, Ray said. The question is, what's got your name on it that you didn't sign?" And I said, "Ray, nothing has my name on it. I never signed anything." And Ray Kubiak, who has never in 44 years told me what I wanted to hear, said, "Walt, when's the last time you looked?" I want to describe the next part carefully, because it is the moment the floor moved. And I've noticed that when people tell stories like this, they rush it, and rushing it is a kind of lie. I did not go home and tear the house apart. I drove home, 40 minutes. I stopped at the Wegmans on Ridge and bought bananas and a rotisserie chicken because the chemo had me on a strange rotation of things I could stand. And the girl at the register asked if I wanted the receipt, and I said sure. I let myself in. I put the chicken in the fridge. I hung my coat on the second hook, which has been my hook since 1987. Then I made coffee at 4 in the afternoon, which I never do. And I sat down with the laptop and I pulled my credit report. All 3 bureaus. It's free. It takes about 11 minutes, and I want every person listening to this to do it tonight.
and I'll tell you why in a second. Equifax loaded first. I scrolled past the addresses, past the 2 accounts I have, the truck, paid off in 2011, and one card I use for gas and keep at 0. And then there was a third line, a revolving account. Opened October 2021, 5 months after the wedding. Credit limit $40,000. Balance $38,200 and change. Current. Never late. Not one late payment in 4 years. The issuing bank was one I have never had an account with in my life. I sat there and looked at it, and my first thought, I swear to you, my very first thought, the thought of a man who has spent his whole life assuming the problem is his own ignorance, was, did I forget? That's what he built. That's the whole machine right there. 4 years of perfect payments so that the only thing a careful old man would ever feel, if he happened to look, was mild confusion about his own memory. I scrolled down. There was a 4th. There was a 5th. There was a home equity line of credit against my house on Millbrook Road, originated in March of 2020 in the amount of $140,000, and the balance on it was $131,000. March of 2020. Dorian and Nora married in May of 2021. He had put a line of credit on my house 14 months before he married my daughter. I don't know how long I sat there. I know the coffee was cold when I picked it up.
And I know I drank it anyway, all of it, in one go, standing up. And I know that when I set the mug down on the counter, I set it down too hard, and the chip on the lip took a little more off, a little half-moon of green enamel that came off onto the counter. And I picked that flake up with the tip of my finger and stood there holding it. That's what my body did. It didn't shake, it didn't cry. It stood in a kitchen at 5 in the afternoon, holding a piece of a coffee mug my wife bought at a hardware store in 1991. And it breathed. And it did not put the piece down for a very long time. Everything I had just spent 2 years calling my life had a different date stamped on it now. Because if the line of credit was March 2020, then he wasn't a man who married my daughter and then got greedy. He was a man who had already been into my house, my actual house, the roof I put on myself, before he'd ever asked her to marry him.
Which meant the wedding toast, the one where his eyes went wet, and he said he'd never had a real family, and now he did. And I stood up and hugged him in front of 110 people. That wasn't a man overcome. That was a man consolidating. I made myself go back through it. All of it, every warm thing, with the new date in my hand. The 20 minutes of questions about Ellen before he opened the folder. I had remembered that as the day he finally saw me. He wasn't asking about my wife. He was asking a widower, gently, over a kitchen table, what his life looked like, what he had, where it was, who else was watching. It was a survey. He was pricing me. The $4,000 in November 2023. I had remembered that as proof he was honest.
Look it up. November 2023 is when the FTC changed the rules on free weekly credit reports, and it made the news, and it was on the radio for 2 weeks, and Dorian Vance had sat in my kitchen that fall and said, offhand, "You ever look at your credit, Walt? Guys our age get hit." I'd laughed and said I hadn't looked in a decade. He paid me $4,000 9 days later. He wasn't paying me back. He was buying quiet during a window when a man might get curious. And I had taken it and told myself I was an old man who invents problems and put the check in the drawer with the manuals. And the $41,000, the loan, the folder, the parking lot, the 4 thank yous, that was never the theft. That was the alibi. That was so that when it finally came apart, there'd be a story where Walter Rhodes was a man who'd voluntarily given his son-in-law money for a business deal that went south. Sad. Common. Boring. The kind of thing a detective closes in a week and a family never speaks of again. $41,000 of my own money, spent to make the other $300,000 look like a misunderstanding. I said out loud, in an empty kitchen, in a voice I didn't recognize, "You didn't steal from me. You bought me." And then I did the thing that I think saved this whole story, and I want to tell you what it was, because it isn't brave and it isn't clever. I did nothing for 11 days. I know. Every part of you wants the old man to get in the truck and drive to Pittsford. I wanted it too. I stood in that kitchen at 5 in the afternoon, and I could feel it in my arms, that specific heat, and I have felt it maybe 4 times in 68 years. But I have pulled a lot of engines apart in my life, and I know exactly one true thing about it. The moment you touch it, you tell it you're coming. Right then, on October 15th, Dorian Vance believed 2 things. He believed I was a tough old bird who absorbs hard things, and he believed I had 4 to 6 months. Those were the only 2 advantages I had, and they were both made of his contempt for me, and I was not going to spend them on the satisfaction of one afternoon. So I made a second list. What I have: 5 documents from the county, 1 credit report, 1 memory of 1 phone call with no recording, which is worth exactly nothing. What I need: how, who at the bank, who is Keith, and a copy of what he actually signed with my name on it. Who I can trust: Ray. Who I cannot tell: Nora. That last line was the hardest thing I have ever written on a legal pad, and I sat there with the pen on it for a long time, because there were only 2 possibilities. Either my daughter knew, and if she knew, telling her was handing him 11 days of warning, or she didn't know. And if she didn't know, then everything I was about to do, I was going to do to the man she loved, in her house, with her watching, and there would be no version of it where I gave her the choice to be somewhere else. I have thought about that a lot since. Whether a father gets to decide what his grown daughter can survive. I decided. You can tell me in the comments whether I was right. And then I did what he was counting on me to do, which is the funniest part of all of it. On Saturday, the 18th of October, I packed 2 bags and a box of yellow legal pads with Rhodes Diesel and Fleet on the bottom, and I moved into my son-in-law's guest room. He carried the heavy bag up the stairs himself. He said, "We're glad you're here, Walt." I said, "So am I." And that was true. It was the truest thing either of us said that year. Here's what nobody tells you about living in the house of a man who is robbing you. It's comfortable. The guest room had good light.
There was a bathroom I didn't have to share. Nora made oatmeal the way Ellen used to, with the brown sugar under the milk instead of on top, and I hadn't had it that way in 6 years, and the first morning I had to stop halfway through and look out the window for a minute. I had chemo Tuesdays. Nora drove me the first 2. Dorian drove me the third and talked the entire 40 minutes about a self-storage development in Batavia, and I listened to all of it, every word, and when he said, "Keith's got the equity side handled," I said, mildly, "Keith Chandler?" And Dorian Vance's hands did not move on the wheel, and his voice did not change, and he said, "Chandler's the entity, Keith's Keith." And I said, "Ah," and looked out the window. There it is. Right there. That's the domino. Because he had never once, in 3 years, told me a last name, and I had just told him that I knew the word Chandler, and he had answered too fast and too precisely, the way a man answers when he has rehearsed a thing he hoped never to need. He didn't panic. Men like that don't panic. But that night, at 11:40, I heard him in the study with the door shut, and the sound of his voice through a door is a sound I now know better than I know my own, and he was not using the warm one. He'd started moving, which meant the clock, which had been mine, was now ours. I want to tell you about the next morning, because it's the morning that everything in this story is named after, and because it did not look like anything.
Sunday, October 26th, 6:40 in the morning. I came down the stairs one at a time, holding the rail, the way you do when your right lung is 80% of a lung. The kitchen was dark, except for the light over the range.
Dorian was at the island in a quarter zip with his laptop open and a glass of water beside it, and when he saw me, he closed the laptop. Not fast, not guilty, just closed it, the way you'd close a book you'd finished. "You're up early," he said. "Habit. Shop hours." "Coffee's fresh." I got down the green enamel mug. I'd brought it with me, of course I had. And I poured, and I stood at the window over the sink and looked at the driveway, because that's what I do. And Dorian Vance said, from behind me, in the warmest voice he had, "Walt, I've been thinking. With everything going on, it might make sense to get some things tidied up. Power of attorney, that kind of thing. Not because anything's going to happen, just so nobody's stuck at a counter with a form." I did not turn around. I looked at his driveway, at the Audi and Nora's Civic, and my truck at the end of it looking like a piece of farm equipment somebody had abandoned at a wedding, and I took a mouthful of coffee that was too hot, and I swallowed it anyway. Then I said, "That's probably smart. I know a guy. Chandler's counsel does estate work too. He's good. He's quick." "Sure," I said, and I turned around and smiled at him, and he smiled back. And if you had been standing in that kitchen, you would have seen two men agreeing about paperwork. Here's what actually happened in that room. A man who believed he had 4 to 6 months just told me he wanted signature authority over everything I own. And he told me on a Sunday morning, 9 days after I said the word Chandler out loud in a car. He wasn't consolidating anymore. He was closing. I went back upstairs and I sat on the edge of the guest bed with my heart going, and I wrote one line on the yellow pad. "He is not waiting for me to die. He is waiting for me to sign." And under it, "So he is not finished," which means there is still something he needs. That was the best news I'd had since April, because a man who is finished is a man you can't catch. A man who still needs something from you is a man who has to keep coming back into the room. The first wave came from the most boring place imaginable, the mail. I'd had my Millbrook mail forwarded to Pittsford when I moved in. Nora set it up. She's organized like her mother. And on the 30th, an envelope came from the bank that held the home equity line. Not a statement, a notice. Annual privacy disclosure. The kind of thing that goes straight in the recycling. It was addressed to Walter J. Rhodes at the Pittsford address, which meant the account's address of record had followed the forward, which meant the account's address of record had been Millbrook Road, which meant that for 5.5 years, statements on $140,000 of debt had been mailed to my house. I stood in Nora's front hall, holding that envelope, and felt the whole thing tilt again. Because there is only one way that works. Somebody had been taking my mail. I thought about the Saturdays. Dorian, for 2 years, dropping by Millbrook on his way back from Batavia, which is not on the way back from anywhere. Standing in my driveway, bringing the mail up from the box at the road, because don't get up, Walt, I got it. I had remembered that as a young man, being thoughtful about an old man's knee. I understood it differently now. And then a much worse thought, arriving about 4 seconds behind the first one, the way the bad ones do. He had been doing that since 2020. He had been standing in my driveway, sorting my mail while I made him coffee. While Ellen's coat was still on the second hook, I sat down on the stairs in my daughter's front hall, sat down hard because my knee went, and I put the envelope face down on the step beside me. And I stayed there, for maybe 4 minutes, doing nothing but breathing through my nose, which is what the nurse at Strong taught me for the nausea, and which turns out to work on other things too. Then I got up, and I put the envelope in my jacket, and I went and did the dishes, because Nora would be home at 6. The second wave was Ray. I met him Tuesday after chemo at a diner on Ridge Road called the Highland, in a booth in the back, and I laid out the county copies and the credit report and the privacy notice on the table, between the salt and pepper, like a man showing another man a bad X-ray. Ray read all of it without saying a word. He read it twice. He's a slow reader, and he does not pretend otherwise. Then he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose and said, "Walt, you got 131 grand of somebody else's debt on your house, and you look like a man who's about to do something dignified." "I'm listening." "Don't do dignified. Dignified is how these guys eat." He put the glasses back on. "You need 3 things. You need to know how he did the signature, 'cause a bank don't just hand out a HELOC. You need somebody official to have this before he knows you got it. And you need to not be alone in that house." "I'm not leaving that house." I figured. He didn't argue. 44 years, and he has never once argued with me about a thing I've already decided. "Then you need a witness in it." "Nora." "Nora's not a witness, Walt. Nora's the reason." Ray turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the saucer, which is what he does instead of raising his voice. "You want a witness, you get somebody with a license to lose." That's how I ended up, on the 6th of November, in the office of a woman named Deborah Osei Mensah, in a converted firehouse on Alexander Street, who does elder financial exploitation for a small firm, and who charged me $400 for the first hour, and was worth every cent of it. She read the file. She asked 11 questions. Then she said the thing that reorganized my entire understanding of what I was in. She said, "Mr. Rhodes, you keep calling this a loan that wasn't repaid. Stop. The $41,000 is the least interesting document in this pile. What you have here is identity theft against a family member, secured by real property, over a period of 5 years. That's not a family matter. That's a felony, and it's a specific felony. And the reason he wants a power of attorney is that a power of attorney would retroactively launder every single thing in this folder." I said, "Say that again." She said it again, slower.
"If you sign," she said, "then everything he's done becomes something you authorized him to do. There is no crime. There's a family arrangement and a confused old man." I looked at the window for a second. Then I said, "He asked me for it 11 days ago." Deborah Osei Mensah put her pen down, and she said, "Then you have until he stops asking nicely." Now, here's where I have to be honest about something that doesn't make me look good. Because if I skip it, you'll think this was easier than it was. For about a week in November, I nearly stopped. Not because I was scared, because of an oatmeal. Nora made it on a Thursday, the brown sugar under the milk, and she sat across from me at that ridiculous island and told me she and Dorian had been talking about trying for a baby in the spring. She said it with her whole face.
She said, "I want him to know his grandfather." And she reached over and put her hand flat on my forearm, right below the port. And I sat there with a folder in a locked truck box 80 feet away, containing the documents that were going to take her husband out of her house in handcuffs. That's the false hope, if you want to call it that. Except it wasn't false. That was the realest thing in the house. The lie was everything around it. I went upstairs and I sat on the guest bed and I thought, he'll pay it back. Maybe I confront him quietly, man to man, and he unwinds it, and Nora never knows, and there's a baby in the spring. And I let myself have that for about 4 hours. Then, at 11:20 that night, I heard him in the study, and the door wasn't quite shut, and he said, and I want you to understand that I was standing in a hallway in my socks like a burglar in my own daughter's house, 68 years old, holding the wall. No, the timing's fine. He's compliant. He's grateful. That's the whole profile. The only variable is the daughter. If she gets loud, I'll manage her. I'll manage her. 9 words. That's all it took. Whatever was left in me that wanted to be a reasonable man went out like a pilot light. I stood in that hallway, and I did not feel rage. I want to be precise because people expect rage, and rage is loud, and loud is useless. What I felt was a kind of cold click, low down, the way a torque wrench clicks when it hits the number. A small, definite sound that means that's it, stop turning, it's set. I went back to the guest room. I wrote on the pad, he said he'd manage her. No unwinding, no quiet. Public. And then I underlined the word public twice, and I have never once regretted it. The third wave was the how, and the how was the ugliest part. Deborah subpoenaed the origination file on the HELOC through a process I did not fully follow and did not need to. What came back, in December, was 40 pages. The application listed my name, my social security number, my date of birth, my employment as Rhodes Diesel and Fleet, owner, which had not been true since 2016 and was true enough on paper to pass. The income figure was $109,000 a year, which is roughly triple anything I ever made. The contact email was a Gmail address, wjrhodes.millbrook@gmail.com, created February 2020. I have never had an email address in my life. Nora set up an account for me in 2021 to get grocery coupons, and I have opened it 4 times. And the closing was done remotely. Online notarization, video, March 2020, which, if you remember March of 2020, was the one month in the history of the American mortgage industry when nobody in the world thought a remote closing was unusual. That's what got me. Not the forgery, the scheduling. He didn't just steal from me. He waited for a pandemic so the theft would look like an inconvenience. There was a photo in the file, a driver's license scan. It was my face, my actual face from my actual license. And I know exactly which photo it is because there's a shadow on the left side from the DMV in Brockport where the light's been broken since the Bush administration. He'd had a picture of my license. I sat with that for a long time. And then I remembered, and this is the one that made me put my hand over my mouth, alone, at a kitchen table at 6 in the morning. I remembered February of 2020. Dorian, at my house, saying he was helping Nora put together a family emergency binder.
Insurance, doctors, the deed, all in one place, in case anything happened. He'd taken photos of everything with his phone at my kitchen table, while I stood at the counter making him a sandwich. He'd used the word, "because Ellen went so fast, and you don't get warning." He used my wife's death as the reason I should photograph my identity for him. I had remembered that afternoon as the day I stopped thinking of him as my daughter's husband and started thinking of him as my son-in-law. I understood it differently now. The fourth wave I didn't find. It found me. On the 18th of December, a woman called my cell. 61 years old, from Webster, named Carol Pruitt. Deborah's paralegal had been running the Chandler entities against civil filings, and Carol Pruitt had filed a small claims action in 2022 against Chandler Point Partners, LLC, for $19,000, and lost because she couldn't identify a person to serve. Carol Pruitt is a widow. Her husband died in 2018. She met a man in 2019 at a grief support group at a church in Penfield. Not Dorian, a man named Keith, who has a last name, and I'm not going to say it here because there's a proceeding. And over 3 years, that man became her financial advisor, and then her friend, and then a line of credit on a house in Webster. They had a pipeline. Keith worked grief groups. Dorian worked the ones with adult daughters, because a daughter gets you into the house. There were, at the time of that phone call, 4 of us that anyone knew about. I was not a victim. I was a customer segment. Carol Pruitt asked me, at the end of that call, in a voice that had clearly asked it before, "Do you feel stupid? Because I feel so stupid." And I said, and I'd thought about how to answer this for 2 months, for myself, at 5 in the morning, and it's the only piece of philosophy I've got. Carol, a good weld and a bad weld look exactly the same from the outside. That's not the fault of the person looking. That's the whole point of a bad weld. The night before the confrontation was the 2nd of January. Deborah had it all. The origination file, the assignments, Carol Pruitt's affidavit, the entity chain, a forensic accountant's summary tracing the HELOC draws into Chandler Point and out again into a personal account at a credit union in Batavia.
The District Attorney's Economic Crimes Bureau had it. There was a date. There was going to be an arrest. And it was going to happen on a business day. At his office. Quietly. The way these things actually happen. Quietly. I sat up that night in the guest room from about 11 until 4. In a chair by the window. With the pad on my knee and the green mug going cold in 3 stages the way it does. And what I thought about was not him. I want to tell you that honestly. I thought about him for maybe 20 minutes total. I thought about Ellen, in the kitchen in Millbrook in 1994, putting her cold hands on the back of my neck. I thought about Nora at 11, with motor oil on her forehead, refusing to wash it off. I thought about the fact that I had spent 9 months telling myself I was doing this for her, and that this was at least 60% true, and I could not fully account for the other 40. And I thought about the sentence he'd said in a credit union parking lot in March of 2023, with both his hands around one of mine. I'd rather owe family than owe a stranger. At least family looks you in the eye. I wrote that sentence on the yellow pad at about 2 in the morning. Then I sat and looked at it until the sky over Pittsford went from black to that dirty gray it goes to in January. Around 4, I made a decision that Deborah Osei-Mensah advised against in writing, and that Ray Kubiak said exactly 4 words about, which were, "I'll drive you there." Because a quiet arrest at an office is a legal outcome, and I did not want a legal outcome. He had said in his own house that he would manage my daughter. He had said on a phone call that I was a logistics problem. A man like that is not undone by a courtroom. A courtroom is abstract. A courtroom is paper. A man like that is only undone in front of the people whose good opinion he lives on. Nora's 35th birthday was January 11th. Dorian had booked a private room at a restaurant on East Avenue. 26 people, his clients, her co-workers, his mother, a photographer. He'd been planning it since November. He talked about it at dinner the way other men talk about a boat. He wanted an audience. I made sure he had one. I'll tell you exactly how it went, and I'll tell you the parts I'm not proud of, too. I got there early, because I have never in my life arrived on time to anything. Ray drove me and sat at the bar in the sport coat I have never seen before or since. Deborah sat at a two-top by the door with a folder and the young man from the DA's office named Anthony who was, I think, about 30 and clearly wished he were anywhere else. Carol Pruitt was there. She'd asked to be. I'd said yes. Dorian did the toast at 8:15. He was good at it. He always was. He talked about how Nora had shown him what family meant, and there was a bit about how the last year had been hard with my health. And he raised his glass toward me and said, "And to Walt, the toughest man I know." 26 people looked at me. I stood up. I want to describe what my body did, because I've told you the whole way through that the body keeps better notes. My knee took a second. My hands were steady. My hands have always been steady. It's the one thing the chemo never took. My mouth was dry. I put my fingertips on the tablecloth, and I said, "I'd like to say something to my son-in-law, and I'd like everyone to stay seated, because it's short." The room did that thing rooms do. I said, "In March of 2023, I gave Dorian $41,000. In that parking lot, he told me, and I've thought about this sentence every day for 9 months. He said, 'I'd rather owe family than owe a stranger. At least family looks you in the eye.'" He was smiling. He was still smiling. He thought this was a speech. I said, "In March of 2020, 14 months before he married my daughter, a home equity line of credit for $140,000 was taken out against my house on Millbrook Road. My signature was on it. I have never seen that document. The email in the application was created in February of 2020.
The photograph of my driver's license attached to it was taken at my kitchen table by him with his phone while I made him a sandwich. The smile was doing something now. It was still there, but it had stopped being connected to anything. Nora said, "Dad." I did not look at her.
That is the single hardest thing I have ever done, and I would do it again. I said, "There's $131,000 still owed on it. There's a woman in this room named Carol Pruitt who lost her house in Webster the same way, to his partner. There are 2 others. This is not a mistake, and it is not a bad investment. It's a business, and my family was inventory." I picked up the folder Deborah had put on the table in front of me, and I set it down flat in the middle of the tablecloth, where 26 people could see it, and I did not open it. And then I said the thing I'd written on a yellow legal pad at 2 a.m, 9 days earlier. I said, "Dorian, you wanted a family that looks you in the eye." I let that sit for about 2 seconds. Look at them. That's when the mask came off. And I'd like to tell you it was satisfying, and it was not. It was the ugliest thing I've ever watched. He didn't shout.
He turned to the room, not to me, not to Nora, and he started talking, fast, in a register I had heard exactly twice before through a study door. And the words were things like cognitive and medication and we've been dealing with this privately. And he was gesturing at me with an open palm, and he was smiling. And the smile was still on. That's the part I can't get out of my head. The smile stayed on the whole time, like a light switch that had shorted. And nobody in that room moved. His mother had her hand over her mouth. His clients were looking at the folder. The photographer had stopped. The silence was worse than anything I could have said. And I said nothing. And I want to be clear that I understood in that moment that the silence was the actual sentence, and everything after would just be procedure. Anthony from the DA's office stood up. Dorian looked at him, and then at the door, and then at Ray Kubiak, 71 years old, standing up from the bar in a sport coat. He said one more thing. He said it to me, quietly, as he was being walked past my chair. And he said it with the mask entirely gone, in the flat business voice from the study. "You were the easiest one." And I said, "I know. That's why I got to be the last one." If this story stayed with you, join us. Like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear this. And as always, thank you for being here. See you next time. Except that's not the end, and I'm not going to pretend it is, because the end of a story like this isn't the loud part. It's the 18 months after. Dorian Vance pled in October of last year. Grand larceny in the 2nd degree, identity theft in the 1st, scheme to defraud. 4 to 12 years at Collins. Keith took 8 to 15 because there were more of Keiths.
The restitution order is $194,000, and I will see maybe a third of it. And I stopped caring about that somewhere around the 2nd hearing. The HELOC was cleared through the bank's fraud unit in 14 months, which Deborah says is fast, and which felt like standing in a river. Carol Pruitt did not get her house back. She got a settlement and an apartment in Irondequoit with a balcony, and she sends me a photograph of the sunrise from it about once a week. And I send her back a picture of the driveway, which is not as good, but is what I've got. Nora did not speak to me for 5 months. I'm not going to soften that. I told the truth about her husband in front of his mother and her coworkers and a photographer. And I did it without warning her. And she was right to be furious about it. And there is a version of this story where I lost her permanently. And I knew that when I stood up. What happened was Ray.
Ray drove out to Pittsford in March, on his own, without telling me, and sat in her kitchen for 2 hours. I asked him once what he said. He said, told her what he said about managing her. Figured she should hear it from somebody who wasn't asking for anything. She called me on a Sunday in June. First thing she said was, "Is the truck still running?" I said, "It's a diesel." She said, "That's not an answer, Dad." And I heard her make that sound that's half a laugh. And that was the whole reconciliation, right there, 30 seconds, the way it always is with us. She moved back to Millbrook in September. Not into the house. She got a place on Sweden Walker Road, 11 minutes away. She's not the same. She's quieter, and she checks things, and I hate that and I can't fix it. She has a lawyer's habit now of asking what document something is based on. I gave her a box of the legal pads. My scans have been clean for 14 months. Dr. Raghavan says the word she wants me to hold on to now is surveillance, which is a hell of a word to give a man with my recent history, and I told her so, and she laughed, which I don't think she does much. I get up at 5. The percolator still ticks 3 times before it starts. I drink from the green enamel mug, the chipped one, the one that lost a little half-moon of enamel on the counter the afternoon I found out what my son-in-law had done to my house. I never got it replaced. I never will. My wife bought that mug at Chase Pitkin in 1991 for $4 and something. And for 34 years it was just the thing I drank out of. And then for one afternoon, it was the thing I held in my hand while my life came apart. And now it's neither. Now it's just a mug again. That's the part nobody tells you. The objects go back to being objects. It takes about a year.
Tuesdays, Ray comes over, and we put a Cummins back together in my garage, very slowly, because neither of us needs it done. And on Sunday mornings, my daughter comes out and we drink coffee at the kitchen table in Millbrook, and she brings the good bread. And about a month ago, she asked me, out of nowhere, looking at the table, "Did you know the whole time? At the birthday dinner, standing up. Did you know it would work?" And I told her the truth, which is what I've got left to give anybody. I said, "No. I knew he'd talk. That's all I had. He never once in 6 years stopped talking. And I just had to make sure the room was full when he did." She thought about that. Then she said, "You're not a nice man, are you, Dad?" And I said, "No, but I'm a patient one." She put her hand on my forearm, below where the port used to be. The coffee was still hot. The driveway was empty. It was 6:05. I looked out the window, because that's what I do.